Okay, so when we'll let Leah get a second from managing the waiting room to start our recording. Oh, the recording has started. There we go. So everyone, it is 2:30 Eastern Time. So welcome to the day three of our SAN what did we call it? The Summer Compliance Series, Hot Topics, Cool Heads. And I'm Cheryl Dowd. I'm the Senior Director for the State Authorization Network and WCET Policy Innovations. And I'm really pleased that you all would join us today. On behalf of the SAN team, including Catherine, Amanda, Leah, Cassie, and myself, welcome to this third day. And you'll see that we have kept this theme of this beach theme. And we're really glad that Catherine found this templates because, there's a lot going on and we want everyone to be able to remain calm. So we thought that if we had this lovely beach scene, everybody will just stay calm as we talk about all the different rules that are coming down the pike that we need to consider. So again, pleased to have you here today. Session 3 is on the horizon, accreditation developments and emerging considerations. So today, I'm joined by wonderful colleagues to share an overview of the outcomes of the most recent U.S. Department of Education negotiated rulemaking meetings addressing accreditation. The rulemaking committee came to consensus, creating a consensus draft language. Except for technical changes, that will be the proposed regulations that the department has indicated will be released later this summer. We will give you the URL to the draft language, but we're having a discussion today with several of the colleagues to preview that draft language and what the impact would be on the institutions so that institutions can start having discussions now. That doesn't mean that they have the final rules, but the consensus language will help inform institutions for their conversations. So when the rules are released as proposed rules later in the summer, they may be prepared to provide public comment should they choose to. So we want to let everyone have the access to the rules. So you see here, thank you, Amanda has shared the consensus draft language so that you have that access. So today, we are going to have a group of panelists, Kelly Costello from the Accrediting Bureau of Higher Education Schools, ABHES, Karen Solomon from the Higher Learning Commission, and Erica Swain from the University of Colorado Boulder, who also has a background as an accreditor. So before we go to that, I want to share some links with you. I'm pulling up my links page to be able to talk about them. So I want to point out first that there will be a webinar on July 15 that is going to be a broad overview of the many regulations that are going to be coming effective in July. And so we want everyone to be prepared for that. And it is a public, open to the public webinar, but certainly WCET and SAN members, we hope, will join us. You can register at this location. I also want to point out the WCET and SAN policy tracker. We follow that on a separate website. You'll find that we are sharing the different policy areas as they more relate to digital learning and compliance. And so we talk about the statutes, regulations, executive orders, guidance, and any court actions that are relevant for our community. And you can find that on the policy tracker. And of course, WCET Frontiers. If you are not already registered for a subscription to WCET Frontiers, we urge you to do that. You do not have to be a member of WCET or SAN, frankly, to be able to get a subscription to Frontiers. And when they come out roughly weekly about policy and practice related to digital learning. And then we specifically have a Frontiers article that just came out last week about the draft rules that we're talking about today. And so you'll see through the overview that I'll provide shortly that it is following a lot of what was shared in the Frontiers article. And then the consensus draft Amanda already shared. And the final piece is the Department of Education's rulemaking webpage for the accreditor rulemaking, which is different than what we shared on Tuesday, which was relevant to AHEAD and RISE. This is for the AIM rulemaking, where you can get the information on the draft, as well as the transcripts are all there for week 1, but they aren't posted yet for week 2. But that is an opportunity if you wanted to see the transcripts or the recording recordings from those meetings that fed into the draft language that we have today. So thank you, Amanda, for sharing those. So can we go to the next slide, please? So this was the introduction. I'm going to give you a little bit of context to address some background information and then key elements of the consensus draft regulations. I can't underscore enough that this is just the consensus draft. This is not the final draft. So when we get to the Q&A portion later on, we do not know what the final rules will say. So we can make some thoughts on those rules, but they will not be complete until we have final language on those rules. But we'll see where the department is intending to go and what the consensus was coming from the rulemaking committee. So we'll talk about those elements, and then we'll move into the panel discussion. So we have three wonderful colleagues here who will help us decipher some of this, and then we'll take your questions. So we go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start a little bit with an introduction for context. So we go to the next slide. Great. So I talked the other day about rulemaking. So I don't want to go into, all of that again, other than to say that the rulemaking, and remember this, that it is developed to implement federal statutes that are created by Congress. So the statutes will either expressly or implicitly direct the administrative agencies to create regulations to implement the statute. Okay. So the Department of Ed isn't making up something new altogether without having some sort of authority to be able to move forward in creating its regulations. And we'll talk about what that means for accreditation specifically. So the agencies must follow the Administrative Procedure Act and added a layer from the HEA to address negotiated rulemaking for rules that are related to Title IV. And then it goes through this process. But the added piece is the convening of key stakeholders to develop the language to achieve consensus. So we throw this idea of consensus around, but if you're looking at rules created by the Department of Justice, et cetera, they are not bringing people together, not bringing stakeholders together to reach consensus before they are addressing proposed regulations for public comment. So that's what's unique about the Department of Education for purposes of Title IV. So it is a multi-step process, as you saw there. So we go to the next slide, please. And I just want to kind of remind you, and we're really thankful to HLC for this graphic, talking about the program integrity triad. And it's evolved through a structure that Congress created in the Higher Education Act to establish eligibility requirements for institutions participating in Title IV federal aid programs. Each of these members of the triad have a role to play. And sometimes you see a graphic of a stool indicating that each of the three legs of the stool are even, theoretically, to be able to provide this role that was established in the HEA. So before we talk about some key elements of the consensus draft language, I want to remind everyone that these regulations are still a work in progress. They're not final rules. The proposed regulations will look almost exactly like the consensus language, but public comment could inform changes to the proposed regulations before they are released as final. So the department has expressed its intent for final regulations to be released by November 1. So remember we talked about master calendar on Tuesday. So if it's released by November 1, traditionally, then those regulations can become effective the next July. Those OB3 related rules had an accelerated timeline that the Department of Education indicated was coming from statute. This is different. And we'll talk about why in a minute, but this was not part of those OB3 directed rules. This was something as these rules were created and this rulemaking was developed, was a priority of this administration that we saw in the executive order. And if you're wondering, Order 14279 that addressed the accreditation, reforming accreditation to strengthen higher education. So before we get to that, we'll be one more second in this area. Sorry, Amanda. So remember I was talking about how there has to be statutory authority for an agency to create rules. So I just want to point out to you that the HEA does direct that the Secretary of the Department of Education shall, after notice and opportunity for a hearing, establish criteria for such determinations, effectively giving the Secretary the authority to establish and enforce criteria for recognizing accrediting agencies that serve as a gatekeeper for Title IV. So we talk about that triad. So we have the Department of Education is approving the accreditors. So I say all this to say that they do have that authority, but it has statutory limits that are established by Congress. So although the Department of Education has the authority to create these rules, there were also some limits placed on that authority that are also in statute. And I just wanted to read some of them to you. First being that the Secretary may establish criteria only as authorized by the statute. The Secretary may not prescribe the academic standards accreditors use to assess institutions. This was something that was talked about quite a bit during the rulemaking about where is that line there in terms of creating rules and infringing upon what is the responsibility actually of the accreditor. And then finally, the Secretary may not create recognition criteria beyond those authorized by the HEA. So we see there are limits. The HEA created this structure and gave it guardrails. And so the Department of Education, in creating these rules, has authority. And so through the rulemaking, there was a lot of discussion about how this stays into the structure that was developed through the HEA. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And you can go to the next one too. So there are many elements addressed in this rulemaking. It was 2 weeks of very thorough discussions. The first week, they took the entire week to address all of the proposed language that the department initially wrote, to then have the discussions and be able to offer their understanding, their goals, to the folks that were on the rulemaking committee, for them to ask questions about, what was the goal of the certain language that they developed. So today, I'm going to highlight 5 areas that seem to rise to the top for our compliance and digital learning community. So first, we can go to you see the 5 there, and then I'll talk about each of them individually. So you can go to the next slide, please. So the first was about transfer of credit and student mobility. So I have some language here. It follows a lot. If you have access to that Frontiers article that I was sharing earlier, you can see some more analysis there about what the goals were pertaining to this area. But essentially, it was a completion issue. They wanted to be able to address the opportunity for completion, and that students, were missing the ability to complete and having credit loss due to transfer, and also regarding adult learners. So they wanted to be able to put something into place. So there's more focus on the institutional policy. So the accreditor will be looking at the institutional policies. So again, I want to point out that these rules are addressing what the accreditors are going to be doing as they work with the institutions that they accredit. So what we have here is they want more focus on the institutional policies that will include increasing transparency about their timelines for review, how they're going to evaluate the request for transfer for credit, and then, and sharing the reasoning for perhaps a denial. And then also opportunity for student appeal. So it is really very much a transparency opportunity and clarity about process for students. And so the accreditors will be overseeing this. The department is putting a priority on having the accreditors review what the institutions are doing. And so they're not telling the accreditors what has to be there, but they're telling them the scope of what they wish the accreditors will do within their authority to accredit the institution. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes as well. Go to the next slide, please. And I did not share this before, but what I would really hope that you could do, please, is we can use the chat for conversations amongst our colleagues. So please feel free to do that. But if you have a question that you would like us to address later on in the discussion, please put it in the Q&A, and we would be very happy to have that as part of our discussion. So thank you for that. So more flexibility to change accreditors. We have known that since the early days of the second Trump administration, the executive order, that they would like to see more flexibility for institutions to be able to change accreditors. It was very explicit in the executive order that they want to promote competition, and also for institutions to have more control and meaningful choices that are directed towards the institution's mission. And so, what we have written about it, and we understand, what the goal is, but we do want to also point out, for purposes of those institutions, they would want to be aware and concerned for disruptions to students, as it could affect their aid. So be aware of what that could mean, and also be aware that in terms of programmatic accreditors, there could be state laws that direct that certain program accreditors will be used for the purposes of program approval in certain states. So might want to be aware of that. So there was concern, and you see here about guardrails, that there was a lot of concern in the conversations about there being weaker. And so the department very much pushed back on the idea that that will not be the case, and that actually it will strengthen. So we'll see how that will be addressed as it moves forward. And then moving on to the next slide, please. And then student outcomes priority. This is something the department has talked about from the very beginning about accreditation, is that they felt that, generally speaking, was that they believed that there were accreditors that were very focused on inputs about an institution, as opposed to putting the priority on outcomes. And so what the department was trying to insist upon was that they would like accreditors to place priority on what students are gaining, as opposed to the institution's inputs. So this priority will mean a review of metrics. And so what we will see here, while the department did not say what specifically the accreditors must have in terms of those metrics, they did indicate some examples of what those metrics could be, including employment rates, earnings, licensure pass rates, and then another one that had far too long of a conversation about graduate and professional school admissions examinations. I think we talked about LSATs I heard like good 20 minutes talking about LSATs. But we can see that there are specific things that they think are a barometer of, student outcomes as being an important aspect to talk about quality of the program. So we'll talk more about that. And then finally, no, this isn't even finally, this is the fourth one: intellectual diversity and academic freedom. And I want to say about this one seems still kind of in the building stage. I am not quite confident myself in terms of what that really looks like. You can see where the goals are, but what that will look like from the accreditor standpoint is still a question mark in my mind. Maybe others are confident, but I am not yet, in terms of what that will look like. So the accreditors are going to be expected to ensure that institutions maintain policy that are protecting intellectual diversity, and that the institutions are implementing those policies. So, for example, there's language in there that indicates to design, that the policies are designed to support, promote, and appropriately prioritize intellectual diversity, which I want to point out here is not defined, and the free exchange of ideas among faculty, to include elements that address intellectual inquiry, student learning, measure student and faculty perceptions on the range of viewpoints and perspectives offered by the institution or program. They offered an exception for institutions or programs that have a religious mission. So it will be very important to see how what that means in a structure. And also I would be interested to see what they provide in the preamble in terms of further clarification of their intent. And then also around the idea of academic freedom, again, looking to the accreditors, that the accreditors will are directed to evaluate the institutions to ensure the institution maintains academic freedom protections that are clearly articulated and applied consistently to faculty, regardless of appointment, classification, race, or other immutable characteristics, viewpoint, or ideology. So again, this section in particular, the department isn't telling the accreditor how to do it specifically. They're telling them to have this oversight in this direction and ensure that institutions are implementing it consistently. So we'll see what that actually moves into as we move forward. And then finally, innovation, alternative delivery models. And specifically for our community, I included this one because in this digital learning community, we talk a lot about, what are different delivery models. And so what we're addressing here, and of course, this was part of the name. The innovation was part of the name of this committee, and the rulemaking was trying to consider the incorporation of innovative models for education, wanting to have accreditors, have a mind open to reduce barriers, eliminate unnecessary limitations. There was significant discussion on how do we know if the innovation is working? So how to build a structure, being mindful that innovation could be an element to greater access for students, but also wanting to balance that to protect students, when those types of opportunities are available. So it's still a balancing act, but with the idea that they are looking for accreditors to be more broad-minded with the different types of delivery that could be provided. So again, that was the last piece, and we are going to move into a panel discussion. I just want to share again what I have shared with you today was coming from discussions and the consensus language. We do not have even the proposed language yet, although we know generally what the consensus language will become the proposed language, but we want awareness at the institution. So having access to this language will help discussions at your institutions about how this will move forward. And so in talking with accreditors, and actually one recently, indicating that this is going to cause accreditors nationwide to have discussions about, what kind of change is this going to cause, within their standards, to be able to be in line with how these regulations may come down the pike. So there's still a lot to be determined. This is very much directed to the accreditors and of what the goal is from this department. And then the accreditors will have to develop their structures for purposes of oversight of the institution. So we'll see where this goes next. So at this point, if we could go away from the slides, and if Leah could pin our panelists, that would be terrific. So while that's happening, I just want to point out again that we have just some fabulous panelists today who are very knowledgeable to help us try to piece some of this apart. It was very complicated. There were questions coming from the negotiators that made people at one point think, how could consensus occur? And yet they were able to come to consensus. And I will say that I want to point out that the Department of Education indicated that the negotiators, if they want to help improve the language, are free to provide public comment when the proposed rules are released. That was I've never heard that before, but I find that supportive. But I will point out again, we have Kelly Costello. She's from the Accrediting Bureau of Health Education Schools, Karen Solomon from the Higher Learning Commission, and Erica Swain from the University of Colorado Boulder. If we could, Kelly, if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll go to Karen and then to Erica. I'd love for people to know more about your background.
Of course. Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be here with y'all. It's a pleasure. And thanks, Cheryl, for sort of setting the table. My name is Kelly Costello. I'm Associate Director of Accreditation at ABHES, the Accrediting Bureau of Health Education Schools. We accredit approximately 500 campuses across the country, primarily vocational technical schools. We're specialized in health education, and we're both an institutional accreditor as well as a programmatic accreditor for medical assisting, medical laboratory technology, and surgical technology. And I have been with ABHES for 13 years.
Great. Thank you. So we're very fortunate, so that what we have here is someone who has programmatic accreditor background and institutional accreditor background, and specifically to the health sciences area, which I think is also a unique angle for us to address. And then we have Karen Solomon. So glad to have Karen with us today.
Hi, thank you, Cheryl. Karen Solomon, Vice President and Chief Transformation Officer at the Higher Learning Commission. For years, I carried a portfolio of institutions and worked with those institutions on their institutional accreditation and all the reviews and things like that. In recent months, I have moved over and am now leading a new initiative called the Credential Lab, where we are building, I built a framework to evaluate and endorse short-term credential providers that are not colleges and universities. So we've moved into recognizing some of those other learning options that are out there primarily for workforce.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And longtime colleague, Erica Swain, we have with us, and she has a background from the compliance staff member and the accreditor review.
Hi, Erica Swain. I'm the assistant director, sorry, I forgot my own title, for academic compliance and authorization at the University of Colorado Boulder. I started my career in accreditation so many years ago, back when Karen was a baby vice president. I actually used to sit right next to her. But I've had the opportunity to work for two accreditors, both HLC and Middle States, and collaborate with the others, as well as several programmatic accreditors over the years, just to deliver training, et cetera, et cetera. Now I get to do it on the other side of the table, which is always interesting, and helping my own institution and my sister institutions in the system interpret and understand the requirements and regulations.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And actually, I'm going to start with Erica with a question, and just to give everybody a better understanding of where we're coming from to even have this session in the first place, is that it was very concerning as our staff was creating, the idea for today, that what does this mean to institutions? What are the priorities here? Some of you may have attended. We had a call several weeks ago, actually could be several months ago now. Leah Matthews was talking to us about what we saw coming down in the future with the accreditation rulemaking. This was before the rulemaking started, and now we've had the rulemaking complete. But I wanted to ask Erica to start with, the AIM committee discussions raised important questions about the future role of accreditation in federal oversight. What should institutions be watching most closely as these conversations continue?
So given my background, I am a bit of an accreditation apologist. That said, I think institutions should be watching two things pretty closely. Is accreditation being asked to become something different than what it historically has been? And if the accreditors have new regulations, how do those requirements get passed on to us? When I was reading back through some of that language in the red line edition that was linked above, a lot of it is information about, the accreditors will need to verify this that an institution does, and they'll need to look at this. That means we have to change things. We have to change what we're reporting. That savings gets passed on to you. And it's difficult for some of us, especially because traditionally accreditation's really focused on educational quality, institutional effectiveness, continuous improvement through peer review. The AIM discussions started to really raise broader questions about whether accreditors should play that larger role in things like workforce outcomes, accountability metrics, financial oversight, and consumer protection. These aren't bad conversations necessarily, but they are fundamentally different than the conversations we've had with our friends in accreditation land in the past. What we need to look for then is where that line is going to get drawn between quality assurance and federal accountability. Who's defining that? What outcomes are going to be measured? What data is going to be used? And what role does peer review continue to play if accreditors are increasingly expected to enforce federally defined metrics? So for me, the real issue for me that I'm looking at is not really, it's not whether the outcomes matter, they absolutely do, but whether accreditation is going to be able to remain that quality assurance process that I love, that we all love, right? Yeah. That's grounded in institutional mission and peer review, or is it going to evolve into something much closer to just a accountability system?
Thank you for that. And so for institutions, be aware of that, about how this is going to impact you as these rules move forward. So this is a multi-step process. Erica has explained, how this will come to the institutions in terms of what their responsibilities will be. Let's pull back just a little bit and talk about, and this is a question for Karen, about, we were talking about the triad and, how these partners are, to be providing the quality assurance. And so, or the program integrity, the quality assurance is from the accreditor, but this program integrity in general. So as the relationship between accreditors and the Department of Education evolves, what aspects of the current accreditation system are working well and should be preserved?
Cheryl, it goes back to some of your earlier comments about the triad. And we work collaboratively with the various elements of the triad, whether it's the federal government or state agencies or a sovereign nation, whether it's other accreditors, maybe programmatic accreditors, and things like that, to really assist in making sure that if we've got competing regulations or policies, that it doesn't become the burden to the institution. We have opportunities within our agency that if there's a state agency requirement that maybe differs from ours, that they have the opportunity to justify and explain why they're following that policy, and will yield to the state agency from that perspective.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think we need to understand how it comes together. So that was very helpful in how it's been working. So just to keep an open mind about all of this, because we all have the same common goals, in supporting of our students. But I think sometimes with rulemaking, all of us, we get kind of like, what is happening here? What is the what do we support? What do we be questioning? And so I wonder, Kelly, could you share, what do you see that is promise in these AIM revisions, and the discussions that you heard, and where do you see the peril?
Yeah, of course. First, I think I'd like to sort of the themes I'm sensing already. I think there's a lot of mystery around accreditation for people who don't live and breathe it like maybe all of us do. And I think that one way we can help set ourselves up for a future that we all want is, like, if you are in contact with your Congress people, your state reps, people who don't know about accreditation, and you could tell them about your relationship with your accreditors and what's important to you and like the benefits you get from it. I think that's very helpful. But to answer your question, there are good and bad in everything. Like, there's stuff that is positive and there's stuff that's negative and there's stuff that's hard to implement or easy to implement that may be either of those things. I know that you already talked about it, but the thing that was most promising to me was the transfer of credit stuff. I think it might be a little hard in actuality and implementation, but as a formerly national or still national, not a formerly regional accreditor, we really struggle with our students being able to take their education other places. Like, a lot of transfer of credit policies say that you have to come from a regionally accredited institution. And so with the barrier that is that taken away, we see that as a good thing for our students who are completing shorter term programs, more mobility upward. And the peril, I think you also talked about that in terms of the academic or freedom of thought or whatever that concept is. You know, one of the discussions during the AIM, just when they're all sitting at the table, someone was like, well, every class should provide both articles that are peer reviewed, that present both sides of every problem. And I was sitting there thinking, not everything has two sides. Like there's consensus. Like you're not going to find an opposing opinion. Or if you do, I don't think it's necessarily legitimate. So I don't know that they've thought through what that looks like in practice or how we as accreditors would ensure that there are those discussions happening during classes.
It does make you wonder then, what does that mean this is down the line. Once this is implemented, then how is the review of the accreditor going to occur to show that those things have been implemented in the way that whoever is interpreting the regulation is going to do. So yes. So thank you for that. That's a very important view. And I think what's really interesting too, and this I'm going to bring to Erica. There is just so much that's misunderstood. So to your point, there are a lot of things about accreditation that are mysterious. And so I want to lean, and I think actually there's a lot of things about higher ed oversight, not even just accreditation, but oversight in general. So Erica, so looking back at the last year of negotiated rulemaking, what do you think institutions misunderstand the most about proposals that were currently under discussion?
I actually kind of heard some of this yesterday in one of the comments that someone made, or it was one of the questions that came up. And one of the biggest mistakes that I think that a lot of us make is that we treat all of this as something brand new. It's not. These regulations come and go. The underlying data, though, that everyone keeps asking us for, just in different ways, is surprisingly consistent. It's surprisingly the same thing. There's also that underlying thing, and this is what I heard yesterday, of, well, yeah, but what if these don't really go through? They don't pass. We need to stop asking that question. Because we hang our hopes on stuff. And I've heard folks at my own system office say, yeah, well, accreditation is going to go away anyway. So and I'm like, okay, but it's here today. It's here now. So we have to keep working on this. We need to know what we're doing. We need to know what we're telling students so we can keep this information. Like I said, it's all the same. It's just being asked for in different ways. So I think most requirements associated with accreditation or state authorization, our workforce reporting that we're going to have to start doing, the consumer protection overlap. There's just such significant overlap about what it is that we're doing, and we're not understanding that. So we keep creating new stuff. I think it would be so much easier to adapt as institutions if we paid more attention to what we were doing holistically, which I can't stand that I've said that, but it is true. It is a very much a what's going on in this office? How are we working on these things together so that we can do better when it comes to not being surprised when things change or not panicking at the last minute? I was joking with somebody the other day. I'm actually off for the next 2 weeks. Like I have one more meeting today and I'm done. And I said, I always take these 2 weeks off. And they said, why? And I said, because if there's regulations coming due, I should be done by now. Because if I'm not done by now, then it's not getting done in time. But it's cyclical. It always happens. It's always the same stuff. It's just different packaging.
That's very interesting. And I think what's interesting in what you just said too is that I think in our community anyway, we're remembering that at the end of the Biden administration, they terminated the state authorization component of negotiated rulemaking. That's super unusual that it would be terminated. Because even at the end of the towards the end of the Obama administration, they put a pause on state authorization after that rulemaking. But then on the way out of the Biden administration, they released, those rules. They came out in December. I don't know if anybody remembers other than me. But there were state authorization rules and a definition of state authorization reciprocity agreement that came out in December on my birthday. And those ended up missing the master calendar date and sitting for a while. So anyway, long story short, people remember that there was a termination, but that's super unusual.
It is. It's very rare. And like I said, we have this habit then of waiting to almost to the last minute, like, oh my gosh, maybe this time it'll happen again.
Right.
And the likelihood is no. I think this is, and I know we're not really going to get into some of the accountability stuff, but this was a conversation myself and some other folks were having with our provost. I don't like surprises. I can't stand them. And so we're sitting here looking at the proposed regulations around accountability saying, okay, what can we do to jump on this with what little information we know, but what we know we have? How can we take a look and start breaking things down so that when it does come time for reporting, it does come time for the department to say our bachelor's degree in dance is not meeting accountability metrics. We can say, yep, and here's what we've already started working on it.
Yep. So it's really interesting that you brought that up, and that was something that Karen addressed just a few minutes ago. So I kind of like to go back to Karen to do more about that. So Karen, does this mean that the higher education community moving forward, that it's a future where accreditation is primarily a quality assurance function, or are we really talking about it being an accountability function, as you were mentioning before, or both? Because Erica was mentioning that as well. So where are we on that, and how do we reconcile that?
I think we've been shifting for a while. More and more of the agencies have started requiring institutions to report student success metrics. And if they're not meeting some thresholds, they're following up with some type of monitoring or things like that. That's been a momentum that's been coming for several years now. And I think it's going to continue to, especially as you have more states requiring quite a bit more data. And our institutions are actually learning how to gather that data and use that data in some ways. I think some of the large systems like Erica's system may have some more advantages and ability to gather some of that data versus a small institution that has 200 students. And everybody's wearing triple hats for their jobs and things like that. So I think it's also how institutions have the resources to gather that data. And that's another challenge for institutions. But I support what Erica was mentioning about be prepared. Go through those regulations now. Make your list of, okay, what do we have in place? What are we going to need to get in place, and how do we start prioritizing that so we can start putting it into our planning and budgeting cycles going forward? I think it's also an opportunity to think about how an institution wants to respond once the public comment period opens, so that they have an opportunity to weigh in on some of these issues and maybe push back on some of them.
Thank you, Karen, for addressing that very specifically, because that is the whole essence of why we were doing this, is to give you all that opportunity to start seeing where it's going. And, I've heard in other presentations from others as well about it's really important that we consider that public comment period is our opportunity to share as practitioners. They could be thinking it from a philosophical level, but making sure that Ed knows from a practical level, what does this really mean? What will this cause? I think it was really interesting. This is a little side note, but the DOJ regulations, when they were just delayed recently for web accessibility, the Department of Justice indicated that part of the reasoning was the ability for practically how to be compliant, and that they were worried about too many would be in a position where they would be there was a liability challenge. And so they wanted to address that at this time, only delaying it by a year for enforcement. But I just think it's really interesting that they're hearing from a practical level, what are the complications? Good rules, just what's the practical implementation of this, and can it be accomplished? So, so I thank you for that, Karen, because I hope that people will take away, what does this mean for them, and how can they help inform, what could be beneficial for the rules. So this kind of brings me back to Kelly. So Kelly, as an accrediting agency, so what would be your process for implementing changes once we have the final regulations that are effective coming out of this set of rules? What would be the accreditor's role then next, to determine what institutions should do?
Yeah. So, like every accreditor, we have standards or criteria, and we have a very defined process for how those are revised. And our typical process takes over a year. We have a lot of inputs, a lot of different groups that look at it. With this, if it comes out, anytime before November, it goes into effect July 1. So for us, it would be a scramble to generate, if any, new standards or revisions to our standards, and then helping schools to become compliant with our standards at that same time that we would try to be compliant with the department regulations. So for us, the department mandates how we do revise our standards and how we get input from people and publish them. And so the timeline has certain things that we cannot exclude. But in this case, when regulations change, we don't have much wiggle room. We can't, our standards would reflect what the regulations are. And so I think as soon as you see what the regulations are, you know what's coming to you next.
That makes sense. So, then to back to from an implementation structure back to Erica. So what we're seeing is this outcomes, this accountability aspect. So several of the proposals that are emerging from like the AHEAD committee would place greater emphasis on workforce outcomes, earnings data. Actually, that's part of the outcomes here for the accreditation as well, and program accountability. So what challenges do institutions face when preparing for accountability systems that have not yet been fully defined? How do they prepare in this atmosphere?
Well, I like a really nice Bordeaux. No. No, how we're continuously being asked to solve problems with data we don't control. And so it's all about that idea. Like I said, I have the director of IR, myself, and my provost. My provost is an economist, by the way. And so we had a great discussion one day about how can we prepare? What does it look like? And how do we start stress testing without scaring anyone? Because we don't want to do that. We don't want to freak the deans out. We don't want the faculty running to the hills. They're mad enough about the AI situation. Let's not get them mad about this. So how can we start taking a look at stuff? And accountability really works best when we have an opportunity to observe, verify, and improve the factors being measured. So we're trying to figure out what is external, what is internal, what could we be asked for, what can we do, what can't we do, where might we need more information, and what are we absolutely confident that we have? And so, like I said, it's that stress testing. How do we push against what it is that we have without breaking anything that at least helps us move forward in this?
So, yes. And so being prepared, having these conversations, and especially making sure that the institution is aware. We often talk about how sometimes some institutions are more aware. They have government relations folks who are really helping especially the senior leadership know, where we are with the development of new requirements, new responsibilities for the institution. So then we come to our community, and we're giving some awareness, and we hope that the institutions then are considering that someone's got their eyeballs on this, so that they can keep following it down the path of when it becomes a final regulations and final responsibilities. But you talk about stress testing, and this back to Karen. what about how do you manage what occurs when the state and sorry, I think that was me. I don't see that but it may have been me. Yep, my internet connection is unstable. I apologize, everyone. Hopefully we're back on track here. What I was talking about was, what Erica has shared with us is, we don't know what it all is going to be in terms of what the rules will be, but you have to start managing. You have to start doing some preparation. And what I was trying to say as well is, what do we do when there's some sort of conflict? This is for Karen. What do we do? How do we consider when there is some sort of situation where the institutional creditor and the state are not aligned? How do we make that work?
Well, some of it may be collaboration between the agencies. On the other hand, it may be that the institution in a filing to its accreditor actually uses the data that they're submitting to the state that's required by the state, and then explaining what that's for. I mean, we've got one state who's looking for their workforce programs, they're looking for 32 or 36 fields of data for each and every student. Just incredibly complex. But we'd be asking them, how do you utilize your data? We're not saying you must have specific data, but how are you utilizing what you're gathering and making informed decisions going forward?
Thank you. So there is a lot of juggling,
Yep.
shall we say,
Mhm.
in terms of what the institution's responsibility is. I'm going to shift. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Cheryl, if I
Please
could
do.
talk for a second about outcomes. At
Yeah.
ABHES, we track outcomes pretty seriously. So we require 70% graduation rates and 70% placement rates and 70% credentialing pass rates for our programs. So all of the programs in our portfolio have to report that data to us. We also track data that is given to us from the Department of Education about our schools, and it often conflicts and causes problems. And on top of that, we are required to track what other agencies are taking actions. And so sometimes it becomes this, the Spider-Man meme where everyone's pointing at each other. It's exactly like that because one person put you on reporting or show cause, and then the next person does because the first person does, and then the third person does because the second person did. And I just really worry that with this new earnings testing and viability of programs, it's going to turn into that. Where is this information coming from? How are we comparing apples and oranges? I feel for you already having so many regulators and adding more complications.
Sure. That is the juggle that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, and I feel this for institutions. So as a matter of fact, I'm going to go back to Erica on this. So to Kelly's point, institutions are finding that regulatory compliance, accreditation, state authorization, licensure oversight, and workforce reporting are becoming increasingly interconnected. What strategies are helping institutions avoid building separate compliance systems that are redundant, so that they don't have to juggle as much, so that they can manage and have a system, that addresses rather than build something new for every new requirement?
Yeah, I actually was just commenting because Karen started bringing me down that path when she was talking, and I had actually just put something in the chat to my earlier comment about not building these new processes. In my experience, it's been, and I'll just read it, it's institutions that organize around the core data elements instead of the reporting processes, themselves, that can adapt much easier to these types of things. When you start having these separate processes, building these separate things, you start ending up with these really strangely connected but not connected, and interconnected but not across your campus. That doesn't help. So I know sometimes a lot of us aren't involved in some of these conversations on our campus, but finding a way to get involved. For example, one of the common elements between Workforce Pell and the work that we do is student location, and it's becoming a very important data element that our institutions collect. We know what student location, everybody here's cool. We all have a policy. We all know what that means. But does the person down the hall who's going to oversee Workforce Pell on your campus know what it means? We were having a conversation today about pulling a data set for some of our graduate students, and it was, well, we'll need to see what state they're from. And myself and the registrar's office are sitting there saying, well, what do you mean by from? We have 3 separate sets of addresses here. Each one means something different. Which do you want from us? How do you want us to use that? Something like location, it affects us. It affects our obligations for licensure, our complaint processes in some places, our clinical placements. So then what happens with Workforce Pell? How do we bring those conversations together so that we don't have to duplicate processes or have different meanings? I also had a meeting this morning where we had to have an in-depth conversation about what do you mean when you say professional program? Because we use that term internally to mean one thing. And we're realizing we're going to have to stop using it pretty quick because we actually only have 2 professional programs per the definition.
For purposes of Title IV. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes. So thank you for that. Which actually then brings me to Karen for a follow-up, because that's very important as we talk about these workforce and non-degree. So if federal oversight expands to include the non-degree, we're talking about for Workforce Pell, in those offerings, what institutional departments will need to collaborate more closely than they do today? What do we do about this?
Well, it's interesting because in many of our institutions, they're running 2 separate student information systems. Or there's one student information system for the regular degree program offerings and things like that. And there's a spreadsheet on the other side. And they're calculating whether it's credit or not or things like that. That's going to be one of the first things that's really going to have to think about how do you enroll students in the system so that they can be tracked accordingly when they're in another division of the institution that hasn't historically been involved. That's what we're hearing from our institutions is probably the big aha that they really need to focus in on. And also then issues such as transfer of learning, evaluation of prior learning quite often may not be done in one division, but it's done on the other side of the house in the institution. So thinking about how to transcript. How are those transcripts awarded and recorded and stored? Once again, very different processes. And so I think our institutions really need to think strategically and have some conversations about what team do we need to build to start talking about this bridge between these different areas of our institution. Once again, doing it sooner rather than later. Yeah. So sort of running that, okay, if we could have a Workforce Pell available for that, not some of our non-credit that doesn't currently stack into a degree or lead into a degree, how could we have it bridge and stack up towards that degree and start talking about that sooner rather than later? Because you're going to need to go through curriculum governance processes and things like that.
Well, I appreciate so much that both of you brought this up, because that is something that's been coming up in conversations a lot more lately since the Workforce Pell rules, have been discussed, because it's 2 different sides of the house. One's kind of run like a business and one's, the academic side. So it's a very different structure and they don't necessarily talk. There's some that maybe do, but there are many that don't. So it is very interesting how that will happen. So I'm going to shift gears again just a little bit about some of the things in regard to the rules, because I think one of the things that we found, and I want to address this with Kelly, the Department of Education was very focused on there being more competition. There are more opportunities for new accreditors to be able to come into existence. So, what are some ways in which competition between accrediting agencies would impact students?
That's a great question. And there were so many pieces of the regulations that will touch on this, from, the easier ability to switch accreditors to the easier ability for new accreditors to become recognized. The department, really, this was a clear focus for them on making accreditation, less of a monopoly. I feel like maybe they accused it of being. Um, and it's fascinating because it's all about the students. That's why all of us are here. That's why we exist. So ideally, you want accreditors that are aligned with your institution's mission because you have a specific mission that delivers to your students. You want some stability, I would think. There was some stuff in the chat about switching accreditors, which for anyone who has done it is a very difficult process.
Mhm.
It's time consuming, it's expensive, it's not something to be undertaken lightly. And so I really think that for students, it could be both beneficial to have that alignment, to have an accreditor that understands your school ultimately benefits your students, I think. But it also could be that bit of uncertainty. Are we accredited or, can we be accredited by our accreditor? I hear about accreditation a lot more than I used to. So I don't know if that's a good or bad thing that more people know the word.
Thank you for that. Thank you for explaining that because there are these concepts that are newer about accreditation that, that this administration has wanted to push forward, that being the competition end. And then also, so just to follow that up in the same vein, Karen, I would love to ask you a question in regard to innovation. Because we want this ability to change accreditors is what the department was pushing for. And then also about innovation, which, they never really defined. And so I thought that was the conversations were really interesting about innovation too. And, balancing the opportunity for innovation while protecting consumer protection, protecting the students. So innovation is often driven by new credential models and providers. So what opportunities and risks should institutions consider when engaging with short-term credential providers? Because this is a whole new pathway that we're addressing these days. So how should institutions be addressing this?
What's interesting, when we were starting to build the framework to evaluate those alternative providers, we had several folks on a design team that were from institutions, and it was their input that was really helpful. We're saying we want to know that they're financially stable, that they will be here through our relationship, that they're not going to close their doors in the next day or things like that. We want to know how they build their different types of credentials. What processes do they use? What are some of the accessibility issues that they take into consideration? Things like that. What's their responsiveness? If they're actually delivering the curriculum to the learners, what is their responsiveness? What should we expect in terms of responsiveness, response time, how to handle situations and things like that? So sort of creating sort of that running list, which WCET years ago, we created one and sort of how you pick a third-party vendor when I was sitting on one of the committees at WCET. So that's sort of the build your list of what you want from a provider, and make sure that you get all of those answers covered, and that you also then have an out clause so that if the relationship's not working, there's an opportunity to step away in an orderly basis. So you stop enrolling students, you let the ones that are currently enrolled wind down, and then you can move away.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. So let's talk a little bit about, how this accreditation processes, because again, back to mystery. Institutions generally may not realize what the accreditors have to go through in terms of being through the initial recognition and re-recognition process. So I was wondering, could I shift to Kelly, if you could tell us a little bit about what does the re-recognition process with the U.S. Department of Education look like?
Yeah, of course. It's a timely question because my agency is towards the tail end, hopefully, of seeking re-recognition. So with the Department of Education, it honestly mirrors the school accreditation process pretty well. So we are given a 5-year period of recognition. And I believe for us that expires this year or next year. And 2 years ago, we started the process with our petitions. That's what they call the sort of self-study where we document all the ways that we're in compliance with all the regulations. What's really interesting is in the past, you'd have like a abbreviated petition. So it's not all the regulations, it's just some of them. However, our petition this time was every single regulation. So they're doing full petitions for everyone now. Then we had a site visit with a Department of Education staff member. So they came to us online to conduct that visit and go through all the materials again. They provided a written report. We had to respond to that report. Our response and the report are going to be presented by us and that staff member in front of NASIKI, which is the National Advisory Council for in something quality and another I. I get the two I's confused, but easily look upable, which is a very interesting committee of politically appointed members, so different seats, and they meet. I think this year 3 times a year, but in the past it was 2 times a year. So they take what the staff member says, what the agency says, what any other commenters say, and they ask a ton of questions. They have readers on the file. And then they make a recommendation, and the recommendation of the staff and the NASIKI board go to a senior department official who then makes the call on what happens with the agency. So it's a rigorous and very long process. And for sure, we feel sympathy with everybody who has to go through that process.
I think the
Yeah.
big difference between that process and an institutional process is the time when you have to make the filing. It's 2 years in advance of the decision. That is what is significantly different. So we've already made our submission. We're going through the stage right now where somebody will come and watch, observe our Board of Trustees meeting to see if we're following our policies and things like that. And we'll add that into their written report. But it's that submitting everything 2 years in advance of the decision, and what can you change or update during that 2 year period of time is a real challenge. It's a real dance. Yeah.
It really does give you a feel for the institutions and what they go through. The last one I worked on was one with Middle States. And it was, Kelly, it was very much like here's a regulation. How do you do it? How do you look at your institutions? And it's just, what can you pull out? And I think we were, if I remember correctly, we were just rolling out the new standards at Middle States. They had just switched from 14 to 7. And it was documenting the entire decision process, how this all came, how we were trained. They were very interested in how we were training everybody, which was my job. So that was fun. And it was very, oh my gosh. Yeah. It made us feel real bad for what we asked the institutions to do.
So we do have some time to be able to take some questions, and I want to make sure that we give our colleagues opportunity to ask their questions. But before I get to that, I do have one question for you all that I didn't tell you I was going to ask you, but it's really just your like advice. What is your advice, each of you, your advice to institutions at this point? What do you think would be a good pieces of advice for them to take away at this point in the rulemaking in preparation for moving forward?
Be familiar with the topics. Make your lists of what you have, and set that aside. And then make your lists of what you need to start considering. Maybe not necessarily working on till the final rules, but at least start considering. And then create your response to the open comment period. If you've got something you feel is just, especially if you feel it's just really unobtainable. Some of the data that they're looking for some of the student achievement metrics, our institutions can't get that. They can't get some of the licensure pass rates because the licensing bodies won't share it. So some of those types of things. So really starting to think about what's feasible and what may be just such an incredible reach. And comment.
Erica, do you have a thought?
I was going to say kind of the same thing, that read through them. It's only 163 pages. But read through, become familiar. And just like Karen said, make notes. We know what this is. We know where to find this. I don't know what this is. I don't know where to find this. And then start, especially because a lot of this is about data, look at your data governance. What does it mean if you have to start reporting on some of this information? How can you work as a campus and not just an individual silo?
Kelly, do you have any good direction for our folks?
I wish I did. The only thing I will say is the department has to read and respond to every comment. So make comment.
That is very important. And the response, just for those of you that aren't familiar, when the final regulations are released in the preamble, they will address by topic area. And sometimes I have seen it happen. The department will say, we were persuaded by public comment to do X, Y, or Z, and then we all feel like this was a win. And so we're all looking for that to help them understand the practical aspects. But what I will say about this Department of Ed that I have seen in the last several proposed regulations is the directed questions. And I strongly urge you, not only as Karen shared about, and Erica too, about reviewing what we have as consensus language right now, but when the proposed rules come out, and WCET and SAND will absolutely direct you to the directed questions because they really want to know what what you think about certain aspects. And it's probably something that they're still trying to weigh, how to implement it. So I strongly urge you to, when those proposed regulations come out, and we'll help you find them, the directed questions, and respond to those directed questions with your practical knowledge. That will be helpful. And yes, Ricky, we were persuaded to ignore this suggestion. Yes, yes, we've seen things to that and oh, yeah, there's a whole lot of different ways that they have indicated that this is not something that they wish to consider at this time. So, yes. So let's move to some questions from our audience today. Catherine, can you help us with some of these questions? And if you would like to pop more questions into the Q&A, we have time for more than the two that we have right now.
Yeah, so we'll start with one. I believe Kelly referenced it earlier in the discussion, and there was some discussion in the chat about it as well. So if Cheryl or if any of the panelists want to weigh in, the question is, can a state effectively compel an institution to change institutional accreditors, requiring it to seek accreditation from a different recognized accrediting agency?
Anybody want to jump on that one?
I will, because I don't work for an accreditor, so I can say things. And Karen and Kelly can just like stare at me. I joke, I saw Kelly's comment and I actually responded to her privately with compel in quotes. I do think there are some states, stares at Florida, that the public institutions are about to be compelled to go to a new accreditor. And they're about to be compelled to go to a new accreditor every so many years, which puts them in a constant state of going through a reapplication process, which to me is a nightmare. I spoke to somebody from one of those institutions about a week ago, and she said, yeah, it's already bananas. Because they know the work that they're doing to get ready to go to their new one, they're going to have to change again in maybe 10 years. And it might be another one of these agencies. It might be the new agency that's, bubbling up. It might be some other agency. It might be a state wanting to create its own. I do think public institutions are more likely to be compelled than private.
Thank you.
And the challenging part is you have to maintain your accreditation with your current agency. So you actually are going dual routes. So you, as an institution, have to follow one set of standards and then be preparing documentation for another set of standards and processes all the way through. So it can be challenging for some of the institutions.
And what's interesting is that the Department of Education has to approve your switch of accreditor, which could be very complicated in the future. I guess, and today. It takes a long time also. It's a not a very quick process with the department.
Well, I think that goes to what we were talking about before in terms of choosing even. So not even compelling, but choosing and being smart about how you're doing it, because you do have these hoops to jump through and you don't want your students to be caught in a problem, as you're going through this process. So yeah, so the change of accreditors can be a challenge regardless.
And I think I might highlight a comment in the chat that shares a little more context from our colleague Molly, stating about in addition to the approach by Florida and North Carolina, which was also introduced and failed in a couple of other states too, there are some states that in their state authorization regs. I'm sure some of us have seen where they require regional accreditation for authorization, like using those terms. Other states might also have processes by which the state can have their own accreditor, recognition agency if they wanted to possibly do that. So just thought I would share that in case anyone missed that in the chat. And let's see. Our next question is kind of a nice overarching question, which is, how does the connection between the PPA, which is the Program Participation Agreement, Title IV, and needing to be accredited influence this discussion?
I wish that was an easy question to answer because I feel like I got to zoom way out for that.
Yeah.
Go back to Cheryl talking about the three-legged stool. But maybe, does anyone else have a shorter answer?
So wait, can you just repeat it real quick? Because I actually might have something.
Repeat the question or repeat
Yes.
the,
Yeah, repeat the question real quick.
yeah. How does the connection between the PPA, Title IV, and needing to be accredited influence this discussion?
Influence this discussion or the larger discussion about accreditation as far as negotiated rulemaking is concerned? Because I know in some accreditors, not the two here, institutions are actually asked to submit their most recent PPA as part of their federal compliance, or at least they were many years ago when I was reviewing them. The providing the most recent PPA was shown as an opportunity to show that the institution understood what it was doing, knew what it was doing, and could make corrective actions around its financial aid program. I think in terms of this conversation, institutions like mine, in order to continue accessing the federal financial aid, I need to both, and we are actually in the process of compiling information on our PPA, judging by the weird questions I'm being asked by financial aid right now, that they're absolutely intertwined. Because if I can't successfully get through my PPA, I have to turn around then and call John Marr and say, hey, John, bad news. We've suddenly lost access. Now, none of this happened suddenly, but, this happened. This is where it goes. The two are intrinsically linked. That being said, I'll just drag my soapbox in. I can't stand the concept of accreditors being called gatekeepers because Karen and Kelly don't have money. They don't hand me a check when I go through my reaccreditation. It's more of one of the various things that we have to go through in order to be eligible for federal aid. It's one of several things. It may be the last thing, but it's one of several. And the federal government has ways that you can get access without necessarily going through this process. It's cumbersome, but it's there.
And let's see. We have another question, which is about how can academic colleges and online units at large decentralized universities support central data teams in responding to potential regulatory changes? And that might be a good question for if anyone wants to weigh in the chat as well. If anyone has any thoughts.
How do you do it, Erica?
The strongest overlap is the evidence. My office collects evidence, the registrar's office collects evidence, student affairs, academic departments, the online space, everybody's got evidence. What you're asking us to demonstrate is that all of these activities work together. I can't demonstrate that unless I'm collecting evidence from every part of campus. So when we go through things, so one of my favorite things to do with accreditation land is to rephrase the standards or the criteria as a question. And then ask, internally, who knows how would you answer this in your office? And then start to have what does that look like then when I build that story back out?
I think we've already talked a little bit too about a lot of this being around student data and identifying what the categories of student data are. And to that same question, who already has that or who has but it's the same words, but it means something else, as Erica was talking about. Get on the same page to help make the end goal of reporting data easier with what you already have.
That's perfect. All right, I see another question came in. Um, let's see, saying out of curiosity, will an accrediting agency be made aware of an institution's desire to switch to or from the agency?
Yes.
Hmm.
We are told often actually by the institution themselves, but the department lets us know that they've received a request for an institution to switch either away from us or to us. And then get copied on their sort of action. I have seen letters that both approve or don't yet approve the ability to switch or the request to switch, which sometimes comes before the institution has even started the process with that other agency. Yeah.
So I have one more question that came in to me from a side route. And so I'm going to share that now. It's somebody who works a lot in the short-term Pell, or is about to work in the short-term Pell realm. So the question was, how will accreditors integrate new changes around completion with their ability to set new policies and procedures for short-term Pell? So what will the accreditor's role be?
Well, typically in our agency, we typically hew very closely to federal regulations. So you could read a federal regulation and then look at our policies, and it's almost the exact same thing, word for word. And so we'll typically follow that. So if there's a certain percentage threshold, which I know there are some thresholds there in the workforce Pell regulations, well, that's probably the exact same numbers that we'll use. Just so once again, not to create that friction between the members of the triad, and not to ask for something more than what the regulation is typically. So that's how we'll follow through on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it requires a lot more input from states as well. They're so keyed in with workforce Pell in particular.
Yes.
Um,
And am I correct in explaining that the programs have to be part of how the institution the program has to be part of the programming that the accreditors are aware when they're accrediting the institution. So these programs may not have been part of, like, there could be a substantive change issue because these are programs that weren't necessarily part of the overview initially because they were maybe in the other side of the house, but now they need to be an awareness to the accreditor. Am I correct? Because the program has they don't need programmatic accreditation, but the program has to be accredited as part of the institutional accreditation. Did I
Correct.
explain that in
Yeah,
any sort of, okay.
Yeah, right now, even our institutions have to report their certificate activity. So,
Hmm.
and many of these are similar to certificates. We've got a working group right now that's building out guidance and documentation and what the application will look like.
Thank you. Thank
Yep.
you. Okay, last call. Any other questions? Any other comments from our wonderful presenters before we move to our closing? We've talked a lot. It's been great. I'm so grateful to Karen and Kelly and Erica for being so thorough in their explanations. I hope this has been informative to everybody. Amanda, could you put our slide deck back up? Thank you so much. I just want to point out here, again, there will be a webinar coming up and you'll see that we did some review of these, of the consensus draft. There's more to come. So be aware of the consensus draft language because it is essentially the proposed rules that will be coming later in summer. But please be aware that these are there and start having conversations at your institution. Could you go to the next slide, please? And I just want I'm hoping that after these 3 days, you still feel this was tranquil, that we had this nice ocean, and look at these pretty flowers and whatnot on the beach. It's very calm. And so, we're trying to, let you all absorb all of this as we move forward. And I hope that it's been effective for you all. And if you need to reach out to any of us, here are our email addresses and our website. And, just again, one more gigantic thank you to Erica Swain, Kelly Costello, and Karen Solomon, as well as thinking back on the last 2 days of just fabulous presenters in the last 2 days, and also to the SAN team, Leah, Amanda, and Catherine for helping me collaborate on all of this to put it together. So we hope you all have a fantastic weekend. We do intend to share these videos out with you. So we are recording. We will send the recordings out to all of the registrants. And but if you do have any questions that come to mind after thinking this all through, please do not hesitate to be in touch. So thank you all and have a fabulous weekend.